They hit #1 in America. They hit #1 in Britain. They recorded 12 studio albums across 9 years. They pioneered folk rock, helped birth psychedelic rock, and essentially invented country rock before anyone even knew what to call it. The Byrds were the sound of the 60s, jangly, rebellious, transcendent. Then Gene Clark walked out in 1966, terrified of flying. David Crosby was fired mid-album in 1967 for being impossible to work with. By 1973, the band was done. The original 5 members performed together exactly once after that, at their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1991. Gene Clark died that same year. Michael Clark in 1993. David Crosby in 2023. The reunions never came. The brotherhood never healed. This is the story of how 5 visionaries created a revolution in American music, and how success, ego, fear, and constant reinvention destroyed them from the inside out. But to understand the collapse, we have to go back to Los Angeles in 1964. Los Angeles, 1964. The folk music scene was exploding. Coffee houses on Sunset Strip were packed with young musicians clutching acoustic guitars, all dreaming of being the next Bob Dylan. Rock wasn't a fantasy, it was survival. It was a way out. Jim McGinn was the visionary, a folk purist who'd backed the Chad Mitchell Trio and absorbed everything from Dylan's camp. He was obsessed with merging folk's lyrical depth with rock's electric power. Gene Clark was the engine, a prolific songwriter with a fragile intensity, churning out originals that felt like instant classics. David Crosby was the wild card, a harmony genius with an ego that filled rooms and a mouth that emptied them just as fast. Chris Hillman came from bluegrass, bringing instrumental precision and an understated cool. Michael Clark couldn't really play drums yet, but he looked like a rock star, and in 1964, that mattered. They called themselves the Byrds, deliberately misspelled like the Beatles. Their product was simple but revolutionary. Take Bob Dylan's poetry, add Beatles-style harmonies, and electrify it all with McGinn's 12-string Rickenbacker guitar. That jangly, shimmering sound became their signature, a sonic fingerprint no one else had. What made them different was the fusion. Folk kids thought they sold out. Rock kids thought they were too intellectual. The industry didn't know where to put them. But the fans latched on immediately because the Byrds sounded like the future. Their first break came through Terry Melcher, a young producer at Columbia Records who believed in the concept. Melcher got them into Columbia Studios in Hollywood in early 1965. They recorded Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, with session musicians handling most of the instruments. Only McGinn's 12-string and the voices were actually the band. It didn't matter. When that single dropped on June 21, 1965, it exploded. #1 in America. #1 in Britain. The Byrds were suddenly massive. But even in the beginning, the seeds of destruction were already there. Gene Clark was writing most of the original songs but getting no more credit or money than anyone else. McGinn was clearly the leader, but Crosby wanted equal say. Hillman was learning on the job. Clark was just trying to keep up. And none of them controlled their own sound in the studio yet. Melcher and session players did. The machine was already bigger than the band. From 1965 to 1967, the Byrds became one of the most important bands in rock. Their second album, Turn, dropped in December 1965. The title track, a Pete Seeger adaptation of biblical text, became another massive hit. 2 albums, 2 number ones. Critics started paying attention. Then came Fifth Dimension in July 1966. This was their first album without any Dylan covers, their first fully original artistic statement. It included 8 Miles High, a sprawling, experimental track that sounded like nothing else on the radio. Released as a single in March 1966, it climbed to number 14 in the US and 24 in the UK. But beneath this triumph, a controversy was building. A radio tip sheet alleged the song was about drugs. The band and their publicist Derek Taylor denied it. They said it was about flying to England, about the experience of travel. It didn't matter. Radio stations across multiple U.S. markets banned it. The momentum stopped cold. 8 Miles High should have been a number 1 record. Instead, it became a warning. Success could be taken away at any moment. What fans didn't see was that Gene Clark was unraveling. He had a crippling fear of flying, and the band's schedule demanded constant air travel. In February 1966, right as they were finishing Fifth Dimension, Clark quit. The most prolific songwriter in the band just walked away. The Byrds kept going, but the balance was broken. Younger Than Yesterday arrived in February 1967, and it marked a shift. Chris Hillman emerged as a songwriter and vocalist, filling some of the gap Clark left. The album was produced by Gary Usher and reflected a maturing sound, more layered, more confident. But the internal responsibility imbalance was becoming obvious. McGinn carried the vision. Crosby carried the attitude. Hillman carried the workload. And Michael Clark just tried to stay relevant. Then came the notorious Byrd Brothers in January 1968, a masterpiece of late 60s experimentation. It blended psychedelia, folk rock, and early country influences. It featured phasing, flanging, spatial panning, pedal steel guitar, and even one of the first uses of a Moog synthesizer on a rock album. Critics called it their artistic peak. But that moment of glory was also the beginning of the end. The notorious Byrd Brothers should have been a triumph. It was ambitious, cohesive, groundbreaking. It proved the Byrds could evolve beyond their jangly folk rock origins into something deeper and stranger. It's still considered one of the great albums of the psychedelic era. But while they looked unstoppable on the album cover, everything offstage was cracking. David Crosby had become impossible. During the recording sessions, he clashed constantly with McGinn and Hillman. He wanted more control. He wanted his songs prioritized. He openly criticized the band's direction in interviews. He showed up to sessions unprepared or didn't show up at all. And during the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, one of the most important cultural moments of the decade, Crosby went off script, giving a rambling political speech that embarrassed the rest of the band. In October 1967, before the notorious Byrd Brothers was even finished, McGinn and Hillman fired him. Crosby found out through a message. He wasn't even in the studio when it happened. The band replaced him with Parsons, a charismatic country rock evangelist who would change their sound completely. The peak had become a trap. The Byrds had made their most artistically daring album while simultaneously destroying the lineup that created their identity, and they had no idea how much further they were about to fall. With Parsons in the band, the Byrds pivoted hard into country rock. Sweetheart of the Rodeo, released in August 1968, is now considered a landmark, the first true country rock album. But at the time, it was a commercial disaster. It peaked at number 77 on the U.S. album chart. Folk rock fans felt betrayed. Country fans didn't accept them. The Byrds were suddenly homeless, stylistically. Worse, Parsons quit before the album even came out, leaving to form the Flying Burrito Brothers. He'd been in the band less than a year. The revolving door was spinning out of control now. McGinn brought in Clarence White, a virtuoso guitarist, and the band kept recording. Dr. Byrds and Mr. Hyde in 1969 reflected the split personality, half country, half psychedelic, fully confused. By 1970, the lineup had changed again. Skip Batton replaced bassist John York. The Byrds released Untitled, a double album with one live disc and one studio disc. It was their best-received album in years, hitting number 40 in the US and number 11 in the UK. The single Chestnut Mare even reached number 19 in Britain. For a moment, it felt like they'd stabilized. Then came Bird Maniacs in June 1971, and everything collapsed again. The band recorded the album with a raw, stripped-down sound. But producer Terry Melcher, without the band's consent, added heavy orchestration and overdubs in post-production. When McGinn and Hillman heard the final mix, they were devastated. The album sounded nothing like what they'd intended. It was released anyway. Critics destroyed it. Fans ignored it. The Byrds' credibility was gone. The lowest moment came during the album's promotional cycle. The band couldn't defend the record because they didn't recognize it. Interviews became tense. Shows felt hollow. McGinn later described it as a betrayal, not just by Melcher, but by Columbia Records, who prioritized commercial production over artistic integrity. The trust was shattered. In response, the band rushed out farther along in November 1971, recording it in just 5 days in London. It was a deliberate attempt to reclaim their sound, raw, honest, unadorned. It didn't matter. Farther along peaked at number 152 on the Billboard chart. The single didn't chart at all in the US or UK. By 1972, Columbia dropped them. The Byrds released one final self-titled reunion album in 1973 with some original members returning, but it was a ghost of what they'd been. By the end of that year, McGinn officially dissolved the band. 9 years. 12 studio albums. Dozens of lineup changes. It was over. After the breakup, the members scattered. Roger McGinn went solo, touring small venues and releasing albums that never approached Byrds-level success. He stayed true to the 12-string sound but became a nostalgia act. Chris Hillman found success with the Flying Burrito Brothers and later the Desert Rose Band. He was the one who thrived, musically and emotionally, after the split. Gene Clark, the man who'd written some of the Byrds' best early songs, struggled with addiction and depression. He released solo albums that critics loved but nobody bought. He lived in obscurity for decades. David Crosby became a superstar with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. He had the biggest post-Byrds career of anyone, and the biggest ego to match. He openly dismissed his time in the Byrds in interviews, calling it limiting. Michael Clarke played in various country rock bands and eventually formed a version of the Flying Burrito Brothers, but he never recaptured any momentum. For years, reunion talk floated around. Promoters offered big money. Fans begged. But the 5 original members couldn't agree on anything. The resentment was too deep. McGinn controlled the name, the Byrds, legally, and he refused to share it. Crosby and Clarke felt erased. Hillman wanted nothing to do with the drama. In 1989, the announcement finally came. The Byrds would be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1991. It took the ultimate music industry honor to force them back together. On January 16, 1991, all 5 original members took the stage at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. They performed together for the first time in over 20 years. They played a short set. They smiled for photos. It felt like closure. But the story wasn't over. Just months after the Hall of Fame induction, Gene Clark died of a heart attack in May 1991. He was 46 years old. The man who wrote the songs that made the Byrds more than just a Dylan cover band died broke and largely forgotten. 2 years later, in 1993, Michael Clarke died of liver failure at 47. Another original member gone. The reunion that fans had waited decades for would never happen now. It couldn't. And the remaining 3 members, McGinn, Crosby, and Hillman, never truly reconciled. David Crosby spent the next 30 years giving interviews where he alternated between dismissing the Byrds as a stepping stone and claiming he should have had more control. He remained bitter about being fired until his death in 2023. Chris Hillman largely stayed out of the public Byrds narrative, focusing on his own projects and occasionally collaborating with McGinn on low-key tours. Roger McGinn became the keeper of the flame, touring as Roger McGinn's Byrds, performing the catalog to aging audiences who remembered when those songs meant everything. The legacy war wasn't about millions of dollars or stolen rights. It was about something deeper. Who gets to define what the Byrds meant? Was it the jangly folk rock of 1965? The psychedelic ambition of 1968? The country rock pioneering of Sweetheart? Or the constant, exhausting reinvention that burned everyone out? None of them could agree. And because they couldn't agree, the Byrds became a story without a clear ending, a legacy that faded not because the music was forgotten, but because the people who made it couldn't stop fighting about it. Today, Roger McGinn still tours occasionally. Chris Hillman is retired but occasionally surfaces for interviews. David Crosby is gone. Gene Clark and Michael Clarke are gone. The music remains. Mr. Tambourine Man is still played on classic rock radio. Still soundtracks movies and commercials. Music historians still cite the Byrds as foundational to folk rock, psychedelic rock, and country rock. Younger bands still name-check them as influences. But the brotherhood never healed. The harmony was always fragile, always one argument away from collapse. And in the end, that's the real story of the Byrds. They created something beautiful and influential, and success destroyed the relationships that made it possible. The system, the industry, the touring grind, the pressure to constantly reinvent, chewed them up. The egos, Crosby's need for control, McGinn's need for ownership, Clark's need to escape, made reconciliation impossible. And time ran out before any of them could fix it. There's no reunion tour coming. No documentary where everyone makes peace. No final album where they get it right one last time. The Byrds are frozen in history. 12 studio albums, countless lineup changes, and a legacy that faded too fast because the people who built it couldn't hold it together. What part of this story hits you the hardest? Did you see the Byrds live? Do you think they deserved better, or did they destroy themselves? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear which era of the Byrds you think was the real peak. And if you want more rise and fall music stories, hit subscribe. We've got so many more bands whose success became their downfall. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.